Welcome to the YouTube channel on poverty and culture. Our channel is dedicated to understanding how culture affects poverty and other social problems. Through discussions with our guests, we hope to understand that connection more deeply and thus find better answers. Our host is Larry Mead, a longtime scholar of poverty and welfare reform and the author of the recent Burdens of Freedom. Our initial ideas about culture come from this book, but the discussion may take us in new directions. Ian Rowe is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, an expert on school reform, and the developer of a new network of charter schools in the Bronx.
Welcome to our audience. I'm Larry Mead, a professor at New York University. We appreciate your interest in poverty and culture, a very important question. We mean by culture simply what life's about, what people think they're doing and trying to be during their lives. And the great fact that we're going to talk about is that America is divided culturally. We have a dominant culture that came from Europe. Most Americans are descendants of immigrants who came from Europe. And on the other hand, we have minority groups who came from the non-Western world, from various other places, including Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And now the cultural differences are, in the mainstream culture, the tendencies are strongly individualist. Most Americans believe that they are pursuing personal goals, and they should do so. And that is the main goal of life. On the other hand, in the non-Western world, cultures are more cautious. Most people adjust to the demands made on them by the outside world, and they don't seek personal change themselves. And the other major difference is about how people deal with right and wrong, the moralism. In the West, the culture is strongly moralistic. People internalize ideas about right and wrong, usually at a young age, and those norms guide them for the rest of their lives. In the non-West, however, the moral structure is more situational, more based on context. People derive notions of right and wrong from what other people expect of them, rather than from general principles. Now, notice that in contrasting the West and the non-West, we're not suggesting that any culture is superior to the other. On the contrary, they are different, and they have different strengths and weaknesses. And there are some things that the West is good at, other things it's not good at, and the same for the non-West. Also, we're not asserting that either culture is tied in any necessary way to race. It isn't the case that whites always have an individualist culture and non-whites have a non-Western culture. That isn't always true. There's quite a bit of complexity about that. And so we're not making any statement here about race at all. We're talking about culture, and that is our initial subject. So Ian, let me now get your reaction to this basic idea.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me on. You put forth a pretty a vibrant theory there, but culture matters significantly. In addition to being a senior fellow at American Enterprise Institute, for the last decade, I ran a network of public charter schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And culture matters, in my view, even far beyond race, gender, because culture really dictates what are the accepted behaviors that drive upward or downward mobility, and you see it on a day-to-day basis. And a lot of my work is focused on what I call the rising generation, young people 24 and under. And how do they start to understand, regardless of the culture that they may immediately be in, what are the behaviors, the social norms, the accepted practices that they need to know that dramatically increase their likelihood of success, regardless of the current culture that they might find themselves in. So, I see the country really trapped in these two dominant narratives that are pressing on young people. First is what I call this kind of blame the system ideology, which is this basically this notion that America is a rigged nation, that based on your race, if you're Black, you're oppressed. If you're white, you're an oppressor. You're powerless. You have no control. You are what you are. You're like just a little cog in this larger system that you can only be saved if there's massive government intervention or reparations, or if suddenly white people, abandon their racist tendencies. Like we're
Yeah.
just like we're all in a system that's dominant, and thus you have no agency.
Yeah.
And on the other side, it's what I call the blame the victim ideology, which is, well, hey, you live in the United States of America. You live in the greatest country in the world. If you're not successful, it's because you have not, you know, really asserted yourself to take advantage of all these opportunities. So if you're a victim, well, it's your doing, and you should have just pulled yourself up by the bootstraps. And what I'm trying to offer is a new way for young people to think about that, and it is this idea of agency. And I define agency, and I think that this will mesh with some of the things you're saying, is agency I define as the force of your free will guided by moral discernment.
Yeah.
Right? That every human being has the ability to make decisions, to move forward, but it's like velocity, it's a vector. You have speed, but you need direction.
Yeah. See, that is so close to my notion of a Western culture. It's almost like you've been reading the same books. It's extraordinary. That's exactly right. The West is a culture of individualism where people assert themselves, and they must do so to get anywhere. But at the same time, they have general ideas of right and wrong, which guide them in doing that and set limits and require that they care about other people and their needs and the community's needs. So it isn't just self-assertion. On the contrary, it's motivated action towards goals, which include the interests of others as well as oneself. And that is actually crucial to our whole success as a culture. But the thing that I would change it a bit is simply to say that the Western culture, which you just described, is actually exceptional. It's not normal in the world. Most people in the world have an attitude more like the other culture you described, where they feel oppressed by outside forces. That is the usual state of mind in the non-Western world. People engage in survival. Life is about survival. Life is not about achieving anything. Or if you achieve it, it's simply to survive. And that reflects the conditions and the long-term background of those societies. The West is actually exceptional. It isn't normal. And the life you're suggesting actually involves serious demands. I mean, the title of my book is Burdens of Freedom. The burdens are heavy, and we need to be honest about that. So there's nothing in this theory that says that it's easy for minorities to overcome their situation. On the contrary, they have to make major changes to see life in the way that you've described, because that is the American way.
Yeah.
And that's not easy. That involves serious struggles and difficulties.
Well, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, but these burdens of freedom that you're talking about, it isn't just minorities. It's white. It's white kids. I mean, imagine if you're living in Appalachia, poverty all around you, and you're being told, "What you're on top of the, you're a white supremacist. You're on top of the heap," and you're like, that doesn't comport. So when I say, agency is the force of your free will, guided by moral discernment, where is that moral code coming from? And I think in today's world, a lot of young people are adrift. Like the institutions through which a young person would learn the behaviors that could dramatically improve their life are fraying. So a lot of kids being raised in unstable families, the reduction of religiosity. So I think we have to put forth a new, embraceable set of principles that young people in particular can rally around. And I'm putting forth a new framework that I call FREE. I'm not sure if we've talked about this, but FREE stands for family, religion, education, entrepreneurship. Free. If you want to lead, we want to build a free society, that we need the next generation of young people to embrace these institutions. So just quickly, F is family. It's not the family that you're from. It's the family that you form. Right? Our religion, having a faith commitment, even though religiosity is declining amongst young people, we need a revitalization to let young people know the power of what a faith commitment can actually mean. E for education, meaning we've got to have more choice in education so that more young people can get access
Yes.
to the body of knowledge that will be critical to them. And entrepreneurship, the mechanism, an entrepreneurial mindset of knowing how is it you can build both financial wealth, spiritual wealth, you can have social entrepreneurs, but problem solvers so that you're not just trapped in some larger
Yeah.
system.
Yeah, that's very well stated. In fact, when you said free, I thought maybe the last E might stand for employment.
What's interesting, entrepreneurship includes employment, but it also includes this idea of ownership simultaneously.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
So, when I went to Harvard Business School, for example, the word equity
Yeah.
meant something very different than it means today. It meant the opportunity to be an owner in an enterprise with unlimited potential.
Yeah.
So the E is deliberately not just employment, because employment suggests that employment's good, working is good, but there's something about entrepreneurship which includes the idea of working, but also this idea of creative ownership.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
so that's an important distinction.
You mentioned Harvard Business School. That right away conjures up an image of an achieving society, if ever there is. I mean, the people who go to HBS are highly selected, obviously, but they've also embarked on a mission. They're seeking to achieve and become entrepreneurs. And my niece went to Harvard Business School. She's now running her own company, and that's the kind of thing you're talking about. Obviously, a place like that is not for the faint of heart. You really have to know what you want and go after it. And you know you're going to face various difficulties, including competition and so on. I think one of the things I find most absurd about the advocacy on the left is the notion that people from quote privileged backgrounds unquote have something given to them automatically by the society. And I say to them, try it sometime. Go to the schools that I went to or you went to, and see how you face the challenges, which are very great.
Yeah, well, I mean, the life is unfair in the sense of it is true that different people have different starting points.
Yeah.
But that's based on a whole bunch of factors, right? My own two children, are my wife and I, we've been married for 15 years now. We both have graduate degrees. Our kids are growing up with an expectation that it's not just college, it's graduate school or getting their PhD, right? And they're white kids who are not in that kind of situation. There's something called I don't know if you've heard about the latest woke practice. It's called a privilege walk. Have you ever heard of this?
No.
Okay, so a privilege walk is in the name of equity. Imagine you line up a group of kids and you say to the kids, if you're white, take 3 steps forward. And then if you're black, take 5 steps backward.
Uh-huh.
So it's a series of questions. At the end of this exercise, it's supposed to demonstrate your difference in privilege, where almost by definition at the end, all the white boys are at the front and all the black kids are way at the back. And it's the most, in my view, inherently racist thing. But the one thing they get right is that they ask, if you were raised in a married 2-parent household, take 5 steps forward. So they actually do recognize the biggest privilege is being raised in a stable household. Yeah,
that's true. That's a terrific idea. I think what you're really saying is that although it obviously matters that people start off with different starting points, that's obviously true. But the fundamental thing about life in a free country is not where you start. It's your own power to choose a future.
Correct.
That is the thing that actually makes freedom possible and meaningful. Now, I mean, I've changed my career a number of times, not always on my own choice. I'm not doing now what I expected I'd do when I was in school. I'm doing something different because different opportunities came to me and I pursued them. And you're doing the same thing. And it's the action and the advantage of deciding how you're going to go forward. That is what makes, in a sense, everyone the same. Everyone who's doing that is, in a sense, my brother and my sister. They are doing the same thing.
Yeah.
And together, we create a society with a quality of dynamism and change that isn't possible if you don't have that attitude. Then if you have the attitude typical of the non-West, where you typically adjust to the world, your fundamental stance is passive, you're reacting rather than acting, then you don't have a dynamic society. In the US, we have a lot of people trying to use Paul's phrase, to work out their salvation in fear and trembling. That's what we're all trying to do. And that isn't easy. And a lot of people would prefer not to have to do that. I don't believe it's true that all of humanity wants to be free. I think that that's actually quite a specialized idea of life. To be free is to face the struggles of an uncertain future. And that isn't for everyone. And if you have a whole society where most people do that, then it's a society with almost limitless energy, because we have all these people trying to move forward in various ways. They may not all agree. Some of them are in conflict, but they're trying to get somewhere. And that quality that generates the dynamism that makes America special. And you don't find this in the non-Western world. And specifically, you don't find it in Asia. Asia, most people are taking orders. They're doing what they're told. They really don't see life in terms of achievement or personal realization in any way. And so that's why I don't consider China to be as much a threat or a rival to the US as many people think. That's not the nature of their country. They are, in fact, waiting for orders, and the decisions are at the top, whereas in America, the decisions are all through the society. Everyone is moving ahead the best they can, depending on their goals. And that's what makes the country so formidable, because that energy is orchestrated by the economy and also by government to achieve certain collective goals. And we do that. We do that, but not without a price, because it does take enormous energy and people are taking risks, and there are losers and winners. It's not for the faint of heart. I think it's quite a demanding society, but it's very exciting. And that excitement is available to anybody who says, I own my own future.
Yeah, I think the author Shelby Steele, if I paraphrase, he says, people who've been oppressed in a way constantly are trying to find ways to reinvent their own oppression.
Yeah.
Because handling the burden of freedom, as you talk about, is so difficult. I mean, part of the reason I run schools is I want to engage young people before they adopt these behaviors. And there's a book called Grit by Angela Duckworth that many people are familiar with, that puts out a pretty compelling narrative, which is grit is this idea of persistence, dogged self-determination towards a goal. You're going to fight through to get through, whatever challenges. But the problem is, for most kids, you're not going to have dogged self-determination unless you actually believe that your efforts are going to reshape your outcomes. It's your responsibility to do that. You're not waiting for someone else. So the question is, where does that come from? Where does that mindset? And that's what I'm really trying to suggest the difference. It's almost like agency it's the precursor to grit. It's the precursor to this idea that I do want to live a free life.
Yeah.
Because it's my responsibility, but I can't do it by myself.
Yes.
So the importance of mediating institutions, the importance of, again, family, faith-based organization, education, and ultimately this idea of entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
I think that's the package. I think that's the cocoon that I want for young people to now embrace, because right now I think the rising generation in our country is to some degree rudderless. On the left, you've got people basically saying, Nicole Hannah-Jones in the New York Times 1619 Project, she says, it doesn't matter what you do. Getting married, getting educated, buying a home, saving, none of those things matter, won't make a dent, because it can't make up for 400 years of what she calls racialized plundering.
But what's funny about that, you look at her own life, as I know it.
Oh my gosh.
I've heard her speak. She's a very impressive young woman. She really is.
Yeah, she is.
She is very accomplished, and she didn't get there overnight. She worked up to it. She's put in a lot of struggle. on that. But she doesn't own that in her rhetoric at all.
Well,
And that's my criticism. I mean, I admire her enormously. I don't agree with her for a second. I think her whole image of America is wrong. But you see, she's doing what I think she's living an individualist life. That's the irony. She is herself living an individualist life, but she's telling other people that they can't. And
this is fundamental hypocrisy. That is part of why I do my work, because these folks are not preaching what they're practicing in their own lives to be successful, and yet being a gatekeeper. Harboring that information in such a way that no, we can't let young people know that. And somehow by saying it to young people, we're insulting to the culture. We're not acknowledging the systemic barriers, and that's the blame the system people who they say no, there is no agency. It doesn't matter what they do as an individual, and that is corrosive.
Okay, but now the question you posed is how we get kids at a young age to adopt a fundamentally positive view of the future. How do we do that? Okay, now here I take reference to the best books I know about the charter schools. I'm thinking of Robert Bendicio's book about how the other half learns. What you learn in that book is that the teachers essentially impose on the children a set of challenges to which they respond, and good enough so the teachers pat them on the head and praise them. And by that early experience, they acquire a sense of confidence that they can approach challenges like learning without fear, that actually they're going to have other people help them. They're not going to be alone, but also they can really do it. And I mean, I can remember my first day in first grade in school when I discovered that indeed I could do it. And ever afterwards, school became a great lifeline because I had this basically thing I could do. And other adults, not just my parents now, but the teachers, were going to pat me on the head and encourage me. And that my identity was that I was a good student, and I glommed onto that. And that was the way I got ahead. I think every child has to have a feeling like that.
Well, it's not just the patting on the head, right? It's the action.
Yes.
Kids rise to the expectation. So to your point earlier about, how do you get kids to think positively about their lives? The nice thing is you don't have to manufacture that. It's there. Yeah. Kids have an inherent desire, optimistic vision for their own lives, even in the most terrible of conditions. But it's when the adults reduce the expectations for what you're patting like, for example, the governor of Oregon literally just signed, you may have heard this, they've just signed a law no longer requiring a kid graduating from high school to demonstrate that they can read or do math. And she did that in the name of equity. She did that, we got to help our Black and Latino kids. It's criminal. It's criminal. And so kids rise to the expectations set for them.
See, it's not enough for the teachers to have positive expectation. The kid has to deliver and has to know that he's delivering. You can't pick it up. The performance has to be real.
It has to be real.
You can do all kinds of things to help the child, but in the end, the child has to do it. And they know it if they're getting praised for nothing. They know if they're really not doing it, and yet people are pretending that they are.
Right, but the problem is that kids aren't, they're not yet mature enough to know when adults are snowing them, right? So, like I've heard, I went to Brooklyn Tech High School. That is one of the specialized high schools in New York City. You have to take a test to get in. And so when I went to Brooklyn Tech, all of us that were there, and by the way, it was very racially diverse, we knew that we earned our spot there. The mayor wants to eliminate that test, right? Imagine if we moved to a scenario that everyone's there, but no one's there based on explicit merit.
I know.
Right? There's something that starts to happen. And I think this is a corrosive element, especially for a lot of low-income minority kids, that when they're just passed along.
Yeah, correct.
they know they don't belong. They know they don't belong. And what's really cynical about, I think, a lot of progressive ideas on this front is that they try to make up for this not by strengthening the preparation of younger people. They try to make up for on the back end by creating quotas to create, sort of a racially demographic,
It goes back to the family. The first authority figure that a child encounters is his parents, and the parents,
hopefully,
they're the ones who say first to the child, "We want you to do X, Y, and Z," and the child learns to do X, Y, and Z, and they get patted on the head for that, and they know they've achieved something. So the form where an adult, a capable adult, promotes the child's confidence begins in the family, and the school takes over from that. And my kids went to a very good school in the West Village. Those kids were so ready to learn, they're pounding on the classroom door to get into the room.
Right.
And they transfer to the teacher the trust they have from the parents. And the parents encourage them. Now the teacher's going to encourage them. They're often running. Their lives may encounter various difficulties, but they will not be helpless. They will, in fact, sense of achievement. All right. Now, the great
and did you have a religious component? Did you have a religious
school? Was an Episcopal school, although the way they operationalized that was very subtle. They focused primarily on an idea of getting along and developing relationships so that people were constructive, and definitely inspired by a religious vision, but it was not explicit.
Yeah, but as you say, inspired by a religious code.
Correct. Okay, so the problem for poor kids mostly is that the family isn't there. They don't have that initial positive experience of the parent setting standards, which the child then satisfies and then internalizes the standards in such a way as to say, now I know I can do this, and I'm going to go on doing it when I get to school and later on when I get on the job, and so on and so on. And that's that connection that's missing. And the best thing I've ever read on this is a book by Hugh Price, who was a long-term lawyer and head of the National Urban League. It turns out, this is hard to believe, he was my dorm advisor in college. I went to Amherst College. And Hugh was 3 years ahead of me. He was incredibly capable, and he helped me deal with various problems as a freshman. He spent his whole career ever since then helping mostly white people deal with their problems. I mean, Hugh is just amazing. Okay. And he wrote a book, written a couple books about schooling, which is basically saying what I'm saying, that the child has to have a positive relationship with an authority figure. Yeah, it should be in the home, ideally, but then if it isn't there, you do it in the school. And Hugh's ideas of schooling are they're kind of top down. They have a quasi-military quality where the teachers are authority figures who set standards, and the children are basically not given any choice. They are simply told, you're going to do this. And of course they do it, and then they acquire the confidence that goes with that. And they're often running, just like the kids that I see in my own kids' school. Now, the school is making up for something that they didn't have at home, you see, whereas the kids that I see in my school came to school ready to learn. They were ready to jump on the conveyor belt and just go running off. That has to be recreated in the school because you don't have it in the home. See, that's the great problem as I see it. And what you're doing, it seems to me, is you're trying to create, somebody has to do it. You're trying to create a system of norms and expectations that will reproduce for the child what they should have had in the cradle.
Yeah.
Fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, this all really hit home for me. So I ran this network of public charter schools for a decade. It was about year 6, and we're in the heart of the South Bronx, and we decided to move our headquarters to the South Bronx. Our headquarters were in the Lower East Side, but the need for great schools in the South Bronx was so huge. We moved our headquarters to 149th Street and 3rd Avenue. A lot of activity going on in that area. And so we decided to do a walking tour just to get to know the neighborhood, get my team, like, this is where we're going to grow. And so as we were walking along, I saw this 22-foot baby blue Winnebago truck with all these people around it. And there was graffiti lettering, and like, what is it? As we came closer, the truck had on its side the words, "Who's your daddy?"
Yeah.
What is that? And it
Yeah.
turned out that the Who's Your Daddy truck is a mobile DNA testing center where literally people are paying $350 to $500 to get DNA samples to find out, like, could this person be my father? Are you my sister? And I knew that family structure was an issue, but I hadn't grasped how fundamental it was. And then, from in terms of really understanding your own identity as a person. And so I
Yes.
started doing research, and that's why I really started to discover the explosion in non-marital birth rates, particularly young women.
Yeah.
And we all know about the teen pregnancy issue, but the non-marital birth issue has really just moved up slightly above the age scale. So in the Black community, for example, in 2019, for women 24 and under who had a baby, 91% were born outside of marriage.
Yeah.
In the white community, it's 61%. These are nationwide numbers. And so I started to realize that young people, there is a need, because every one of those kids still needs to have a great education. But the school does need to play an even more critical role in establishing those expectations, not only around academics, but also, again, it's not about the family you're from, it's about the family you form. So
Yes.
how do we have young people, even in those situations, who all around them, they only see troubled families who are all working, who are working hard. But it's different if you were to grow up in a different type of community with different social norms. How do we start to help young people understand the
Yeah.
norms and behaviors that are much more likely to lead them to success?
I mean, you hit on what is probably the deepest problem of the poor community, which is the family, the breakdown of the family. That clearly is the most serious single problem. And I have to say, I've written a paper about this. I think the only person who wrote a paper about it. One can imagine solutions, but they're remote from any political feasibility in the short term. So what the schools end up doing is becoming the family which the child should have had.
Yeah.
And I think for the most part we have to accept that situation. And this doesn't mean that the family can't make some demands on the child. One of the attractive things about the success schools, unlike KIPP, is that they actually do expect something of the parents. If you send your child to a success school, you
Yep.
have to read to them every night, and you have other requirements.
Yeah.
And that is really crucial. That gets the parents on board. They're now starting to do the things they should have done all along, maybe.
Yeah, because even I will say though, even with what I just outlined, it can never be the situation where the school tries to essentially usurp the role of parents. So even in the most dysfunctional situation,
Yeah.
single mom or grandparent, you've still got to come to the parent teacher conference. You still there's still X number of minutes,
Yeah.
to be read per night. There's still daily homework that's got to be done,
Yeah.
even in the most dysfunctional situation. And in fact, it's even more critical
Yeah.
in the most dysfunctional situation. So I would just caution you to say that even Success Academy, I think I've spoken to Eve about this lots, that you can't replace that role. It's almost like the expectations have to be even more stringent. They may sound unfair, that may sound harsh, but it's, in my view, and I think in a lot of view of top educators,
Yeah.
that's what's necessary.
See, but to return to the idea of cultural difference, I think what we're saying here is something that I think Americans don't initially want to accept. That is that to live in a free society does presume a basic set of norms about good behavior that people have to have at the outset. And so even in a free society, you have these norms, and you can't do without them. And in fact, what's distinctive about a free society isn't that the norms are absent, but that they have migrated from outside to inside the self, so that most people police their own behavior.
Yep.
because of the norms they learn in the cradle or in school.
Yep. Or in the church.
Yep. Or in the church. And in fact, historically, the ways in which Black America started to become individualist in its psychology was through the school and the church. They began to go to school even under slavery, and later, and of course, they're going to church too. And so you have, my estimate is maybe a third of Black Americans are actually now individualist in their fundamental view of life. but they are the middle class. They are generally the achieving blacks who've moved up in the world because they have the attitudes that go with a free society, and they're making progress. And it's the rest of the group, which is still living in a non-Western way, which views life in terms of survival, which doesn't really think in individualist terms. They're typically not going to church, not going to school, or if they're going to school, they're going through the motions, and they really aren't learning what the school is trying to teach them. And the upshot is that we don't see progress for this group. So that's the group where we have to somehow change things such that they begin to think of life in an individualist way. And that's what I think the good schools are all doing, and you're certainly trying to do.
Well, you have to think back, what's the founding of the country? Think about the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the amendments. The United States wasn't formed to be a self-governing nation on the assumption that it would be the government dictating behaviors. Like, the whole idea was a very limited role for government and let people be free. But there was a recognition that in order to have a self-governing society, you still had to have institutions that helped shape the behavior, the civic organizations, the mediating institutions, because the moral code has to come from somewhere, right? So it's got to be families, faith-based institutions, schools. Those are the three anchors. And we got to lean heavy on them. And I think in some ways, the intense role of government intervention over the last 5 decades has started to push out the role of churches, community-based organizations in playing this essential role.
Yes, I think that's right. The founders saw the threat to the country coming from the top, from the leadership, from political leaders who might be corrupt or were self-seeking, hence the enormous focus paid in the Constitution to prevent this, to prevent unjust rule. So they assumed that society was healthy, even if government wasn't. Okay. And that was certainly the assumption. You still see that vindicated in de Tocqueville's Picture of America in the 18th. It's all about a functioning society where people work together to achieve.
They make associations. They solve problems locally. It's all about agency.
So all of that assumed that people already had a set of norms of good behavior that allowed them to cooperate with others spontaneously without governmental direction. That's true. But what's happened now, and I think there's really no avoiding it, because of the breakdown of the family among blacks and also Hispanics, you have to remember, those groups, also Native Americans, they also have seen a collapse of the family. Because of that, some outside force had to take over, and it was either government or more often it was nonprofit funded by government.
Absolutely.
And they have had to take over that role and try to restore the essential structure of good behavior, which is necessary even to a free society. So society is not liberated in the sense that there are no norms at all. On the contrary.
Oh, no, there are always norms.
Yeah. So but we don't see them so visibly because they're now mostly internalized, at least among people who are functioning. We have notions of good behavior that we learn in the cradle and which we take for granted afterwards. Well, we can't now take them for granted. There are people who don't naturally think of life in these terms. Again, the non-Western world, the norms are external. They remain external. And it's only in the West that they have migrated within the self so that they become matters of conscience. I mean, the very idea of the conscience as an overseer of your own behavior, that really is a Western idea. You don't find this in the non-West. You find external authority. And people defer to authority, whereas in the West, they embody authority. They have become possessed of the set.
Well, yeah, you're the master of your own destiny. That's the whole idea. That's the whole idea of America.
It doesn't mean you're liberated in the sense that you can do anything you want. No, you have a set of expectations, some of which you've chosen for yourself, and others of which you've learned from the cradle.
Right. I think the thing America is based on rights and responsibilities.
Yes.
I think what we have to be careful of, though, is how do you have this conversation without it becoming the blame the victim narrative that I talked about, where you're being so paternalistic. And so you got to, again, for the rising generation, like, who don't yet know how to make these decisions, how do we have them think about this? That especially when they're in situations, they're growing up in situations in which
Yeah.
don't necessarily reflect the norms that are likely to help them succeed, right?
Even
So,
though, even though their own parents will honor those norms rhetorically and believe in them. That what's distinctive about Black society isn't that people have different values. That's quite wrong. They have the same values, but for mysterious reasons, they're not able to live by those values as fully as other people. So there's this enormous gulf between the values that they have, just like other Americans, and the
right.
actual life they live. And how that gap develops is, I think, tied into this difference of culture that we're talking about.
Yeah.
Because coming from a non-Western background, you don't immediately think in terms of norms as something that you own, that is part of you. Rather, it's outside, it's external. You have to obey these various authority figures out there. Okay, but that's only the beginning. In theory, you should be owning those norms yourself, and you should give yourself the direction about what to do and not do. That's the real American life. But we don't get that until we've initially learned those norms, hopefully in the cradle. And that's the place where I think the schools have this tremendously difficult mission that they're trying to perform that function, which should occur in the family, and in general is not now occurring, at least for these groups, for the seriously poor groups.
Right. Well, part of the reason I've written my book Agency is that, I mean, this may sound like a perverse thing I'm about to say, but the issues that we're talking about are not isolated anymore to just in the Black
No, no.
community. It's across. It's what I call an equal opportunity tsunami,
Yes.
right? And that there's segments of the Black community, segments of the white community that are all facing the self-destructive behaviors that start with the breakdown of the family. So
In fact,
how do we use the fact that this is now an American problem? How
it
do
is.
we use this phenomena to rally more people to come to the realization that there is a necessary element that's not just policy driven,
Well,
it's culture driven?
yes, yes. One thing I emphasize in my book is that the breakdown of individuals' culture has occurred, especially among low-skilled, low-educated whites, especially men. They are withdrawing from the labor force.
Yep.
That's one of the reasons why now the white family is in trouble, as well as the Black family, the Hispanic family, and they've given up. They've gone over to a life of survival, more typical of the non-Western world. And meanwhile, at the other extreme, I estimate something like a third of Black Americans have, in fact, appropriated the individual's culture and made it their own. And many of them are quite successful.
Of course.
Getting ahead. And that's because they've shouldered the responsibilities of being a free person. And now they don't all get ahead. Some of them will have enduring reverses of various kinds. There's no guarantee that you're a big success. But the thing you can guarantee is that you make meaningful effort towards your goals. And
Right.
that's what Americans really expect of each other. It's not that everybody's a winner. That isn't true. But that everyone's trying. And it's the effort that they finally, that's why, I mean, if you look closely at the public opinion polls about welfare, for example, you find initially what the public wants is that people on welfare should have to work. That's the first demand they make. Okay. But if you look at it closely, what they really want is effort. They're not even saying that you have to succeed in getting a job, but you
Yeah,
have
you
to.
have to be looking for a job, something, going through training, putting
Exactly.
together a resume, just
What they
show
want.
evidence. Yes,
You know,
yes.
there's one study of this where a white man who's part of an encounter group, he says, "Why don't these people fight for themselves?" He means the non-working welfare people. Why don't they fight for themselves? See, he'd rather have welfare recipients fighting to get ahead, even though it might make his life tougher. He might face more competition if that was true. Okay, bring it on. Bring it on. Everybody needs competition.
Well, I think most people have empathy in the sense of, look, there but for the grace of God go I. I might be in that situation, right? And
Yeah.
so you don't necessarily demonize someone, but at least you want to see them making an effort, as you say,
Yes.
to make it forward.
Yes,
It's the permanent subclass, I think, that people get very frustrated by. And they get frustrated when policy
Yeah.
actually helps to encourage that behavior.
Yes. I mean, one of the values we get in from a religious background is very important here is there's second chances and third chances. We don't give up on people. The people may screw up and make mistakes. Okay, they have to admit that, but it's not over. The game is never over.
Yep, the game is never over.
Students every other day, they come to me to talk about their future, and some of them are pessimistic about what they're going to do. They may not have done as well in college as they thought they were going to do. For example, I say to them, the game isn't over. There's going to be another inning and another inning after that. You're just starting down a road that's going to involve a lot of twists and turns. I assure you that's true. I've been there myself. And they can't believe any professors have had a hard time in life. No, on the contrary. This is not a place for people who are unwilling to change direction when it's required. So, that's what we expect of people. We don't expect success. We do expect effort, and we do expect a positive view of life. So, you're preaching to the converted here, Ian. I mean, I'm so much in your camp, you can't imagine. And
well, the thing that's nice to hear that, but you and I are rare in a dominant narrative right now, where the narrative is not, you're always in the game, because there's a dominant narrative right now which is saying you're not even in the game because the game won't even allow you to be a player, or we won't tell you the rules.
This is one reason we're doing this podcast. The podcast is all about culture as an important influence on poverty and other social problems. And we're not saying that society doesn't have problems, but we don't think they're fundamentally due to racism. Racism is outdated. That was true 50 years ago. It's no longer the major problem. Our problem, rather, is cultural difference between groups that come from the non-Western world and who have had a hard time adjusting to America, which is an individualist country. And I think what you're doing really is promoting that process of assimilation, whereby groups that initially weren't individualist become individualist in order to join the mainstream. And I think Blacks may well be ahead of other groups in this respect, partly because you've been at it longer. After all, this is a group that's been in the country for a long time. Hispanics are actually further back, I would say. They are still struggling with the very idea of being in a free country. I see that from my students. Hispanic students are often troubled. They don't lack ability and motivation, but the difficulty of being organized so that you can actually pursue your goals is very, very hard for them. They often have family problems, which they have to take responsibility for, and it distracts them from moving ahead in their own goals. So they're facing the same struggle. I think Blacks get more attention because their needs are more acute and they have a longer history. But actually, the other groups are facing very similar problems.
No, absolutely. I saw a developing study that looked at the frequency of the appearance of the word racism in media over decades. But over the last few years, the incidences of the terms structural racism, so no longer just structural racism, systemic racism, institutional racism, these prefixes that again are in this sort of blame the system ideology. So I want to create a new prefix in front of the word racism, and that is surmountable racism. This idea, you got to instill in young people's head, yes, life is a struggle. You're going to face a challenge. Sometimes it'll be based on your race, or it'll be based on any number of factors. But this idea of surmountable and overcomer's mindset. These are very important principles that, in my view, help to develop a set of young people that won't crumble under the pressure. Like you're saying, a third of Blacks now, in a sense, have developed this kind of overcomer's mindset. Because I can guarantee you, every single Black person that's successful has faced racial discrimination.
Yes,
but it's not so debilitating that you stop moving forward. That doesn't mean we shouldn't all be fighting to remove racial barriers and all that. But to suggest that in this country, systemic, institutional, structural are the end all and be all is just
See, what's ironic, I've said it before, is that the advocates who say that are themselves actually exemplars of an individual style.
Exactly.
They are
Exactly.
doing what I would recommend. I don't agree with them, but they are asserting themselves. They're sticking their necks out. They're taking risks. They are elaborating the discourse for good or ill. I admire them personally, even if I don't agree with them. But we have to face the fact that most of their group is not living this way. And then they tell them that it's hopeless because you're trapped by this racist system. And in fact, that's not very plausible. What they're actually doing is expressing the pessimism that goes back in the non-Western world. This is how people who come from the non-Western background, where typically they didn't have opportunity. There's a lot more racism out there than there is in America. And they are therefore, they can't imagine the idea that they might be free. And we're going to face that with all the immigrants coming in from these countries like Afghanistan, for example. They're not going to, it's not going to be a bed of roses here.
Right.
The minute they get settled, people are going to start saying to them, well, what are you going to do now? You know, what's your goal? How are you going to get a job?
How long is the Amazon?
Those requirements, those expectations will be there. So we don't just give people something, we make expectations. We expect they're going to make an effort to move ahead. And other immigrants have done that, but it's an adjustment. It's a real adjustment.
And the corrosive impact you're talking about doesn't only hurt young minority kids.
Yeah.
Right? The corrosive impact also hurts white kids who are again being told that they have this, exalted position in society, and that's not what their reality says, right? So it hurts everybody. And so to the degree that we can make it known that this idea of agency is the principles are accessible to everyone, right? That this is a part of the human condition, and that there are a set of organizations, institutions, again, starting with family, that have to be the anchor. And we try to make this, we don't pathologize it into a specific community, because I actually think that hurts when that's just black kids, and they're doomed, And the more we make this a universal issue, this idea of an equal opportunity tsunami, we recognize, let's get into this together. We need in our country right now some common challenges that we're all fighting to overcome.
The thing that you're doing, which I think our podcast is directed at doing, really, is shifting the discourse away from race and racism towards these cultural issues.
Yes.
They are actually more hopeful. It doesn't indicate that there's a simple solution. I don't say that for a minute. There's a long struggle ahead, but it's doable. And there's no idea of an absolute barrier. On the contrary, we're going to be a multiracial, multicultural society, and that's just fine. We have a lot to learn, each group from the other groups. But we have to keep this fundamentally individualist viewpoint where life is inner-driven, has to do with your own goals and values, and you pursue that as best you can. And whatever your outcome, you are contributing to a dynamic society from which everyone benefits. And that is your fundamental contribution, however your own life comes out.
Absolutely.
And we need to honor that. And we often do. I think a lot of America does honor the individualist struggle, but we got to apply that to all groups, and we need to see some progress against the disorders that we see, particularly at the bottom, where people are not living that way now, and we have to promote a different way of life. That's all there is to it.
Yeah, and each time you say individualistic, I always want to make an asterisk that we're not saying pull yourself up by the bootstrap, because there are folks who hear that and just assume, oh, you're in the blame the victim. And so it's just important to highlight it, right? Because there was a study done a couple of years ago about Black men who successfully made it to the middle and upper class, right? And of course, the study, we obsess over failure. Do we ever really try to analyze, well, what is it that's contributing to the success of this particular group that narrative-wise are doomed to oppression? And it turns out, of these Black men who've made it to the middle class or beyond, they have gotten an education, they had full-time work, they generally married first before having children. Right? And typically they either had a faith commitment, maybe part of the military, and then most importantly, they had a sense of personal agency. And they felt their efforts could help control their destiny, but only through interaction with these institutions of faith, family, and in this case, also military. And so individualistic is at the core, helped shaped
Yeah.
by these institutions that play such a crucial role.
I agree with that. And we don't give up on anybody. There are people who
Yeah.
make mistakes. We don't write people off. And especially the fathers of families where they have disappeared and the families are struggling. I say we can't do without these daddies. They absolutely
No, they're crucial. They're crucial.
absolutely crucial. And we have to get them back in the family. We have to promote the two-parent family. And then have the family function better, because that would make everything easier for the later institutions, especially the schools. That's really what we have to do. Well,
And you know, there's a lot of neuroscience around brain development also that I think is also starting to emerge about the first couple of years of life, well before you enter schooling, right? So that's related to family structure as well.
absolutely, absolutely. Okay, Ian, we're out of time now. I just want to ask you if you want to make any final statement or anything we haven't said that you'd like to add.
Well, well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity. And I do think fundamentally, those of us of all races who have been successful in our own lives, and we've done it by embracing the principles around family, faith,
Yeah.
hard work, entrepreneurship, free enterprise, that we have the confidence to preach what we have practiced in our own lives, not as a bludgeon to blame people for not being successful,
No.
but to share it and to say, when we're thinking about the future of our country, of the rising generation, we're saying there are pathways.
Yeah.
You still have the power to make your own choices in your own life, but there are pathways that are much more likely to
Yeah.
lead to success. And that's what we want to make sure more young people are exposed to.
Okay, Ian, thanks a million. I'm sure we'll have further comment. We have run out of time. I'd like to thank Ian Rowe, particularly for participating in this discussion and offering his point of view. Please share this video with others and make sure to subscribe to our channel. Several other discussions of poverty and culture are also available on this channel. We urge you to view them. Everyone is different. In later weeks, we will have further discussions of poverty and culture with other discussants. I'm Larry Mead. Thank you again for watching.